Hello and welcome to another edition of On the Line Perspectives on Partition, a series organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust, in which prominent people from across the community and across the political spectrum share their thoughts on one of the most significant events in recent Irish history, the partition of the island 100 years ago this year. My name is Paul McFadden, and our guest today is an academic, historian, biographer, campaigner, a former member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Dr. Margaret Ward, welcome to this series. I notice you're usually described as a feminist historian, Margaret, and I suspect that the role of women, or maybe more accurately, the absence of women at key points in Irish history, with a few obvious notable exceptions, that might feature prominently in our conversation. But we'll see where it goes, you know. But if I could begin by inviting you to fill in a wee bit of your background, just for the purposes of context in this discussion, because your background, you have involvement with you've Republic of Ireland blood pumping in your veins. You have lived in Belfast. You were born in Germany, so you and your family are almost representative of the whole Irish experience in a sense, you know.
Hello, Paul. Thanks for having me on. Yes, I was thinking that so many of us are, encapsulate all the different kind of challenges and contradictions of what's happened to the island over the last 100 years, because my mother's family from Mayo and my father's from Dublin. So unfortunately, I never really talked enough to my mother about her background. But she did say that she remembered hiding in a ditch when the Black and Tans were raiding the family home.
Really?
So she was born in 1912, so she'd have been about 10. And my uncle Jack, who was older, was in the IRA. So that was obviously why they were raiding. And my grandfather had a draper's shop. So there was that background. And then on my father's background, he came from a very strongly Cumann Gael background. In fact, Michael Collins' sister was a next door neighbour of theirs, he told me. And Dad was became a blue shirt and was an organiser for Owen O'Duffy, the leader of the blue shirts, even though my father was very young. He was only about 18, 19. But he said, and he wrote up his memoirs, which I have. They're interesting, although I so disagree with everything that's in them. But I mean, he said that he helped to get O'Duffy out of jail one time, and Dad then went, as many young Irish people would have done, to England in the 1930s because there wasn't work in Ireland, and he joined the British Army. Whereas my mother, who had trained as a nurse in St Vincent's in Dublin, also went to London, I think just around the start of the war, because she was nursing in London throughout the war, and they met then. So they came from very different backgrounds, but they were both Irish. And my mother never liked any what she would call unpleasantness. Therefore, they would never really talk about politics.
Yeah.
And although we then travelled all around many different countries, hence I was born in Germany, I never really knew. I would be told, in a divide, in Cyprus, don't say something about the Turks or the Greeks or and I was 10, I wouldn't have known why. And they took that same attitude when we then came back to Belfast in 1963. I was 13, and my father was then retired from the army, but he was army recruiting officer for Belfast. And I just had no idea of what we were coming into at that time.
It's an extraordinary background, I have to say. It's interesting you go down the road of history as well, pursuing that in terms of your career options and all of that. When, bringing that personal experience to the table and your profession, the benefit of many years of studying history, what are your thoughts on the act of partition 100 years on? And we'll explore things that have ensued from that over the course of this conversation, but the actual act itself, 100 years ago, well, what's your view of it?
Well, an absolute tragedy for Ireland, and part of me lives 100 years ago because, you know, I'm always looking at documents and archives from that far back, and one of the things that really got to me is I've spent a lot of time researching women's suffrage and the fact that women from North and South in the period before the First World War were working together to get the vote for women, even though some of them would have been unionists, some of them nationalists. What they agreed on was that women were second class. Well, they weren't even citizens, but they were a second class sex, and they wanted to change society, not just for women getting the vote, but to change all the kinds of man-made structures, the fact that there were no women in a court service or judges or magistrates or police, which meant that men were able to get off in terms of wife beating, small incest with small children, etc. It was a man-made world, and they were forever talking about that. So they were united in that. And then, you know, the First World War came along and divided women a lot. But then partition was just such a blow when you're thinking about you're in a society, living in a small island, and suddenly 6 counties of it have been divided. And Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who I've written most about, her husband Frank's family were from the north, so they were Downpatrick and Belfast and some in Dungannon. In 1913, Hannah and Frank were both in Belfast speaking on suffrage. Now, she said she had a bit of a hard time. They were speaking in an open air meeting on Ormeau Park, and a lot of the people heckled her for her Dublin accent. Frank was all right because he had a northern accent. But that was in 1913. In 1916, Frank is murdered. Then there's partition, and Hannah is served with an order barring her from the 6 counties. And in 1933, she crosses the border to speak on behalf of women who were in jail in Armagh, and she serves a 1-month sentence in Armagh jail for that. So in a really short period of time, in 20 years, 1913, she's speaking in Ormeau Park. In 1933, she's in jail because she's crossed the border. And, you know, if you think about our own period of time, that's really not a long stretch.
Yeah.
Your life to have been changed completely. So that was the reality for people 100 years ago. And then for us, I think growing up, my family, my aunts in Mayo would have come up and visited us in Belfast, but only until the Troubles started. Then what we got was food parcels, you know, as if we were, you know, in some refugee camp somewhere. We got the Jacob's biscuits, the Mikados, and all of those sent up regularly, but they wouldn't come. They were frightened to come across the border themselves. So, in a sense, the repercussions of partition were revived again because of the Troubles, and our families were all split again. The only other member of my family who lived in the north, my cousin Michael, was very involved in People's Democracy and the civil rights movement, and he, you know, he had been brought up in Magherafelt, so that was the only other member of the family that was in the north. And as far as the cousins were concerned, it was almost a reason why partition should exist. There was a real kind of barrier. They felt that the north were troublemakers in the family, and there was a real kind of division that we really didn't see each other unless we went down there on holiday.
I don't know, you know, how prepared as an historian you are to hypothesize, but I just wonder what difference, in your opinion, the involvement of women, had there been significant, meaningful involvement of women in politics in Ireland 100 years ago, what difference might that have made to what happened then and what has happened since?
I know, because, you know, I think about a big meeting in Dublin in 1912 when women from North and South, Unionist, Nationalist, were petitioning all the political parties, the Prime Minister and everything, about getting the vote. And they kept saying, look, we don't agree on everything, but we agree on this and we want to work together. And that was something that the male politicians simply were not doing at the time. But women were outside of all of those political structures, and that capacity to transcend difference and to look for what we have in common just wasn't there. And I think, I'm not saying that women are natural peacemakers or anything like that, but I think that because women have been so outside of the structures of power, what you see, and I've worked with, I'm not just an historian. For a number of years, I was the director of a women's organisation here, and working with working class women, you can see that women are kind of like an early warning system for what's happening on the ground. They know what's happening, they know the undercurrents, etc. But they are also powerless to do very much about it. But they've always been the ones who've tried to work together, and I've seen that year after year. I was women's officer for Belfast City Council in the mid-1980s at a really difficult time, and my admiration for the women who were doing all this cross-community work then, but they never were telling their menfolk about it. That was one of the problems, I think. You had a whole kind of peace-building movement of women, but it wasn't being publicised because it was felt it was too dangerous for them to be talking about it. But women, I think, have had that capacity throughout our very troubled history.
It's interesting you mentioned there about things being too dangerous. You know, I think back to a recent project I was involved in which a woman from a unionist background here in Derry described their experiences, and they harked back to that era of the civil rights movement. And as they saw it, they you know, suffered many of the disadvantages that their fellow women on the nationalist side of the political divide encountered. And they didn't have big fancy houses, they didn't have great incomes, they felt shut out from many things in society, but they didn't, you know, feel comfortable enough maybe to come forward and to join the movement. Why is it that something like that can happen, that they can see, you know, they would say now the benefits, maybe the advantages of the, you know, the achievements of the civil rights movement, but they didn't rush forward to sign up for it and to lend their weight and support to it?
And how could they have done? Because they would also, in that sense, be seen as being critical of the Northern Irish state, you know, because it was a political movement. It was a movement for housing and an end to discrimination. But when you drill down, why was there discrimination? You know, that was propping up a government that couldn't have maintained itself if it hadn't gerrymandered, for example, the boundaries of Derry. So they were really in a very difficult position. Equally, I think, for example, take the flag protest of a decade or so ago in Belfast, talking to women then, a lot of the working class Protestant women were saying they didn't support it. Some of them might have been out on the streets with it, but they were saying they were out in the streets because they were so worried about what was going to happen, particularly to their sons. They were kind of out there almost minding them rather than just letting them go. They couldn't have stopped them, but they wanted to make sure that, you know, things didn't get out of hand. So they were in a really, really difficult position at that time as well. Very, very difficult for them to speak out. And one of the reasons we've had, you know, the importance of women's centres and women's groups is it's that women-only space, because that's when women can really talk about, you know, what is happening without kind of that repercussions. You know, it's kept within the group.
You mentioned at the outset how partition had been, you described it, a tragedy for Ireland. What did partition do for or to women on the island? I mean, I'm asking that because I'm conscious of the fact that the issue of gender violence has been very much to the fore in the news recently, and there's so many other issues which which many people would regard them as women's issues mainly, and I'm putting that in inverted quotes, you know, has the position of women, a lot of women in Ireland, north or south, advanced significantly or meaningfully over the course of the last 100 years?
It has more recently, but it's taken a long time. I mean, Connolly talked about a carnival of reaction, north and south, if there was going to be partition. And I think that carnival of reaction is seen most clearly in terms of what happens to women and to children when we see, you know, the horrors of the say the mother and baby homes, the strength of the Catholic Church and the dominance that it had within society. But I think that one of the things in taking the North, one of the immediate things that partition did was that it meant that people who had been strong leaders in terms of the women's movement were no longer there. I'm thinking even you take the very first members of Cumann na in Belfast in 1914, nearly all of those left for various reasons, and a lot of it was to do with partition. And I like to tell the story because I think it's representative of more. I mean, the late Maurice Hayes said that what happened after partition in terms of the Catholic population was a second flight of the Earls. So many people left the North. They either were barred from living in the North, or they left because of intimidation or lack of jobs. But Roisin Walsh was from Clougha, farming family. She got a great degree in languages. She went to Cambridge and got a teaching qualification. She then went to Germany before the First World War and taught there, had to leave because of the war, came to Belfast, was teaching in St Mary's College, joined Cumann na. In Easter 1916, she was home in Tyrone and helped with the volunteers when they were hiding out in the hills, etc. there. And then she comes back to Belfast as teaching, but has to leave through intimidation. Teachers were very visible and I think easily kind of spotted. So she goes home, and then when there are the local government elections and there's Tyrone County Council, which is predominantly nationalist, until the Northern government stops PR, she gets a job as the first woman rates collector. And then she's served with a barring order and goes down to Dublin, and her family sell up and go down to Dublin with her. Now, Roisin Walsh becomes Dublin's first city librarian, and she has a really distinguished public career. She's always a Republican. She wrote a lot in Padre O'Donnell's literary magazine, The Bell. She stayed friends with people at Hannah Skeffington. She was always there on the left. But somebody that we could have really done with. And she's not the only one. Lillian Metcher, who was the leading suffragette in Lisburn, she left, went down to Dublin. Lots of people, they just could not stay in the North after partition.
You mentioned earlier, I mean, you mentioned James Connolly a moment ago, and earlier you mentioned Hannah Skeffington. Connolly had big plans for her, hadn't he? He identified potential, great potential in her, but it was never, I think, realised, really, was it? Or
well, she
says
says
active political involvement in that sense, if I put it like that.
Well, she and Frank knew Connolly well. I mean, Frank was a member of the Citizen Army when it was first organised as well. I mean, he left when it became more militaristic, but when it was a workers' defence force, he was part of it. So they were always friends with Connolly, and were part of the Irish Labour Party. But Hannah says that she met Connolly just before the Rising, and he tells her that equal opportunities and women's suffrage will be in the proclamation. So they're obviously having those kind of conversations before. But he also says, you know, don't leave Dublin if you're going away, thinking of going away over Easter. And, you know, we're going, if the Rising's prolonged, there'll have to be a civil government as well. And your name's been put forward, you would be on that. So she would have been the only woman. There were people from the Labour movement, etc. William O'Brien would have been one of the members. So she would have been the first Irish woman on a government if that had happened.
Yeah. I mean, I think of partition as one kind of form of enforced separation. We've had another one subsequent. I'm just thinking back to the fact that you were born in Germany, you know, and that you have siblings, I think, scattered in different parts of the globe, you know. What do you think has been the impact of Brexit, you know, on relations within Ireland, between North and South, within the North, between these islands? You know, how do you view that that action?
I mean, madness, you know, but, you know, in the fact that, you know, we didn't want it here. Most of us didn't want it. And I think it, you know, as everyone's talking about, it shows the fragility of the United Kingdom and the fact that it's, you know, it's an imposition from Westminster. So the Scots and the people in Northern Ireland didn't want Brexit, but they've got it. But on the other hand, you're thinking, well, if it starts to have people questioning the efficacy of the United Kingdom, is it really benefiting us? Then I think bring it on, you know. For the outworkings, because we've been locked up for the last year, it's very hard to know what the outworkings are when you're going out and about, except, you know, everyone's talking about if they did get a summer holiday ever, you know, all of those, you know, who can get an Irish passport and who can't. But I think that what that's another fantastic outworking of Brexit, the number of people now who've got Irish passports. And I think once you get an Irish passport, it surely must make you think of something. You can't simply be British because you've actually got proof that you're also Irish or solely Irish, depending on how you view yourself. So I think that there's lots of positives about Brexit, and I think that the media they haven't focused on any of that. I mean, it's always negative. The fact that, you know, that we're part of a single market could have great economic potential for us. And, you know, people complain that that's never talked about. It's always, you know, the fact you can't get parcels in from Britain rather than what else could happen if we, but what could happen if we had political vision here as well, which is sadly lacking. The fact that we have an executive that can't agree, is totally divided on the issue of Brexit, means that the potential for Brexit is difficult to realise as well, because nothing is actually happening politically in any kind of positive way.
You sort of touched upon the issue there of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the border down the Derry Sea, that issue. How frightened are you about the way in which that has been dragged to the fore? And I mean, it is kind of reminiscent, I think, of something you mentioned earlier on as well, the flags dispute, which was, you know, a matter within Belfast City Council then, which went on to have enormous repercussions for, you know, for the whole of society in Northern Ireland. And it's not difficult to imagine the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol having the same kind of impact.
I know, and you know, people get led up to the top of the hill all the time, and then what happens? You know, it can be very frightening for the rest of us trying to live through some of these moments in our history, or, you know, remembering back to the Ulster Workers' strike, and then the Paisley had another strike a couple of years after that and shut down. But what happens at the end of it? I mean, to me, Ulster Unionists are the wrong side of history now. That the history is that partition has lasted for 100 years, but only through political chicanery and the fact that, you know, it was a failure, really. It was a failure for Carson. Carson never wanted this. It was a failure for the the Protestants and 3 Ulster counties who were just thrown to one side when the numerical count didn't go the right way. You know, there are so many issues being brought up at the moment. Now, I'm not saying that it's happening overnight, but I really feel that there is no vision from Ulster Unionism now. All they're doing is reacting. They're putting forward nothing positive at all. And I feel that it'll be interesting, I guess, you know, when we find the what happens in the census, how people define themselves. It'll be very interesting in the elections in 2022. You know, I remain an optimist, even though, you know, we've had hard knocks in the past and things haven't gone in a positive direction. But you sort of feel that we can't keep going on like this. We've reached a point where we've got a political system that's so dysfunctional, an infrastructure that's crumbling. COVID has shown our health service isn't fit for purpose. There has to be something more. And I think if we take away the politicians, there is so much, and you would know, Paul, from being in Derry, that the kind of Derry, Letterkenny, Derry, Donegal, you know, those kind of areas, a lot of the time the border is irrelevant to people's daily lives, and, you know, in other parts of the north as well. So, and there's been so much done through peace programming to build up border areas that had suffered so much from partition, and kind of revive them again economically and all the rest of it. That I kind of feel that we're growing, in some ways, growing closer. And I was thinking of Ulster. I've been writing a bit about Ulster Unionism and their views 100 years ago, and I can see a lot of what they were saying then was we're worried about what United Ireland would mean in terms of our families, because the dominance of the Catholic Church, the Pope had only put out the Ne Temere decree in 1908. There was a whole thing, you know, that all children would have to be Catholics, that mixed marriages wouldn't be recognised by the Catholic Church unless, you know, they jumped through hoops or whatever. So you can see quite clearly it's something that would be so very deeply personal to women, why they would be reacting. But now the 26 counties is much more liberal than the 6-county area. That kind of argument no longer persists. The 26 counties is not the poverty-stricken, kind of agriculturally dominated area that it used to be. It's the one leading the way forward. We've lost all our traditional industries. You know, we're in a completely different situation now. So the talk has to be happening.
So as a final question to you, Margaret, then, and in light of what you've just been saying there about how the Republic is a very different place to the, you know, the Free State of, you know, a century ago. What does that mean then in terms of the prospect of there being a border poll in the near future? I mean, how soon, in your opinion, is a sector state for Northern Ireland likely to conclude that there should be one? And how do you think people, again, I'm inviting you almost to speculate, you know, and maybe as an historian you're reluctant to do that, but how do you think people might vote? Because there are those in political unionism who would say that if there was a vote today on whether it should be United Ireland or not, then the majority, a significant majority, will vote to remain in the union. What do you think?
Well, I'm not in favour of a border poll in the immediate future, because I think that just as we voted on Brexit, the people who are pro-Brexit, I mean, did they really know what they were voting for? What does a border poll mean, you know, in terms of our day-to-day lives? You know, and there've been great discussions about this in all the different forums, the Shared Ireland kind of ones and all the others, on, you know, well, what would our health service be? The things that really matter to people now. We need to be having those conversations. The privatized system that they have down south isn't what we want. I mean, the the welfare state is very dear to us in the North, and you know, it has to be a united Ireland, or a shared Ireland, I prefer to call it. It has to be based on the highest principles, not the lowest common denominator. And we need to be talking about that, and that needs to be done. I get very impatient when, you know, when you're watching, say, Micheál Martin just talking about his shared Ireland unit. I have no idea really what that's doing. What you'd much like to see is something in public happening, different citizens' assemblies, different groups of professionals, different working class groups, women, whatever, all been having a say on what they could see is the future, and that being public. So we could all start having those conversations ourselves. It shouldn't be left to an elite or people who are really involved in politics. It has to bring in people, because people are frightened of the unknown. And for a lot of people, that's still a step into the unknown. And so we really need to prepare. And the more we can prepare good foundations, then I think we've got a chance of success. But it would be a disaster to just do that again. It doesn't work, and we're left waiting for, you know, another Secretary of State in another time. We don't want this kind of devolved situation to continue forever, but we need to see how we can work our way out of it. And there are lots of great ideas coming out. You know, it's no longer the idea that everything will be ruled from Dublin, for example. It's far too centralized anyway. It's a top-heavy system that they have. You know, something, you know, Stormont still could have a role in some way. You know, what would that be? And, you know, unionists can still have a role. I think if we go back to history, when we had the Government of Ireland Act, there was supposed to be a Council of State then. And, you know, there was this idea that possibly partition wasn't going to last that long. And the Council of State was one mechanism by which North and South could be interacting. And of course, the Unionists didn't want it, so it fell to the wayside. And I think that was the start of a lot of the real problems. If we'd had a Council of State and had continued being in conversation, maybe some trust and commonality could have developed from that. But that's what we need to be thinking. What kind of structures can we put in place now? And I don't think the Irish government is doing half enough. They could have done much more in terms of nominations to the Seanad, for example, and have some good Northern voices in there for a start.
Look, Margaret, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I mean, it's been a fascinating conversation. It's interesting. I think a number of people over the course of this series have expressed a similar view to yours, that it's a conversation that maybe now is not the time for a border poll, but that it is a time for a conversation. And I'm all for, you know, respectful conversation, that no unpleasantness, as your mother would have put it, maybe no unpleasantness, and let the conversation begin. So thanks a million for joining us and agreeing to go on the line with your perspective on partition. Dr. Margaret Ward, thank you for joining us.